Anybody relate to that? Just curious. Anybody relate to that? Yeah. Yeah, you in the back right there. Hey, last week I kicked off a new series entitled Breathing Room. So everybody just take a deep breath. Boy, life is so much better when there's breathing room, isn't there? And before I continue, though, today, can I just take a moment and say thank you? This past week, our community, there was a tragedy that struck, a tragic loss in one of the families in our community. And they reached out to us, not knowing where else to go. And I just want to say, you guys responded in such a powerful and positive way. You provided food for a funeral meal. You were there for support. You were praying for me during that time as well, and I so appreciate it. And I am so proud to say this is my church family. I just am, and I am so thankful for the way that you poured out your love in such a powerful way on this family and the difference that made in their lives this week. And I just want to encourage you to keep praying for them. These next several days and weeks are going to continue to be a struggle for them and a challenge for them as they try to cope and try to figure out where to go next. So just keep praying for them, that those seeds that were sown this past week, that God will bring those to harvest. And that's what I want you to do. But I just want to say thank you, and I'm very, very proud to call you my church family. I just am, for the way that you responded this past week. Breathing room. Last week we defined breathing room as that space in our lives between our current pace and our limits. Everybody in this room, we have limits, both schedule, time, relationship-wise, finance-wise. We all have a certain limit. And breathing room is that space that we have that's between our current pace and our limits. And all of us, I don't think I have to convince you of this. I think you're in agreement with me on this. Life is so much better when we have breathing room, isn't it? Life is so much better when there is space. And as we saw last week, for most of us, this issue of space, this issue of breathing room, really comes down to a faith issue. It's a faith versus fear issue, because deep inside of us at times, there is this fear that if we don't do it all, if we don't do everything that we can, we may not matter, or we may not get it all done, or something may fall through, or our kids may fall behind. And so we push ourselves to do everything. And the whole time, God is over here saying, listen, trust me. Trust me to fill in the gaps in your life. Trust me. And breathing room for God's people has always been about trusting him. We do what we can, and then we got to trust God to take care of things. And God wants us to trust him. And so for a lot of us, breathing room is about trusting God more. And so I gave you these cards last week. I don't know if you picked one of these up or not. If you missed last week, I'd encourage you to grab one of these cards, because this is very helpful for our lives to figure out what we need to add, what we need to subtract, what we need to do more of and less of, so that all of us can find that breathing room that I think we so desperately need in our lives, because life is so much better with breathing room. But can you give me just a moment to confess to you today? I stink at breathing room. I stink at finding time to rest. I'm a busybody. I've always got to be on the move. Anybody else? I can't sit still. I've always got to be doing something. And so I stink at this, and I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to do better. God has been so gracious with me, and he's teaching me through this process. And it's not a stretch to say this past week I was overwhelmed. Last Sunday, I stood before you overwhelmed. I knew I had this funeral coming up. I knew it was probably going to be the toughest funeral I had done. I knew that I had Sunday to get ready for, and I've got all these things going on, and I was just overwhelmed, and I did not know how I was going to get it all done. I did not know how it was all going to come through. And on Tuesday afternoon, I just received a text message that said, hey, we're praying for you. And in that moment, I needed that. I needed that, and it just stopped me in my tracks, and I said, you know what? I so appreciate you praying for me, and it's a good lesson for me that I need to trust God more. I need to depend upon God, not myself, through this week. And if I do that, if I do what I can and trust God to do what only he can, then we're going to be okay. And it was a great reminder for me, but sometimes in our struggle to find breathing room, we get so overwhelmed with everything that's going on that we can't even focus on what we're doing at that time. Has anybody ever been there? This morning I went to make coffee, and I was thinking about preaching, and I was thinking about this, and I forgot to put the pot under the coffee maker. Okay? Anybody ever done that, by the way? We just get so overwhelmed, we forget what we're doing. We can't focus in the moment, and that is why we need breathing room, because I think our natural tendency, especially when it comes to our schedules, and I want to talk about our schedules today. When it comes to our schedules, I think our natural tendency is to cram as much as we can into our lives and into our schedules. I just think that's our natural tendency. That's what we do. And oftentimes what we do is we cram more things in without taking anything out. That's just what we do. Someone once told me, when I was in driver's ed, by the way, they said for every 10 miles you're going, you need to leave that many car links between you and the car in front of you. So it'd be 6 or 7 car links. You know why nobody leaves 6 or 7 car links on the highway? Because if you do, somebody's going to cram a car in there. That's why nobody leaves that. I think the same thing happens in our schedules. We don't leave any time because every free moment that we have, we feel like we got to cram something in there, because a lot of us find our identity in doing things, in being busy, and in doing stuff. That's where our identity comes from. And so we got to cram as much stuff as we can. The problem is that causes us to juggle, doesn't it? Anybody in here, can you juggle? Not well, right? I can't juggle real well. I can juggle one baseball at a time. That's about it. All right? And when we juggle our schedule, the more things that we throw in, the more things we juggle, you know what happens? The likelihood of us dropping something increases. The more you try to juggle, the likelihood of you dropping something increases. And the problem is, all the things that we are juggling do not hold equal value. They just don't. There are some things that we can drop that aren't going to cause much damage at all. But then there are other things that if we drop those, they're going to cause great damage, and the consequences are going to be far-reaching. And so the problem a lot of times becomes, I'm not sure what to let fall in my schedule. We've got to decide what we're going to let fall, what we're going to juggle, what we're going to drop, because if we don't make this decision, guess what? It's going to be made for us. And we are going to drop something because we can only do so much. We all have limits. So listen, if we're going to find breathing room in our schedules, we've got to be intentional about it. We got to be intentional about it. Now, why does this matter? Why does breathing room in our schedules matter? Well, it matters for this reason. You only get one shot at life. Are you aware of that? You only get one shot at life. There are no do-overs. There is no reset button. You only get one shot at life. You only get to be 20 once. You only get to be 30 once. You only get to be 40 a couple times, okay? You only get one shot at this life. And you really don't want to get to the end of your life and look back and be filled with regret, saying, I wish I had done this, or I wish I had done that. You only get one shot at this life. You don't want to waste it and come to the end of life with regret. Recently, I read where Mike Tyson, you remember Mike Tyson, the boxer back in the 80s and 90s? In his biography, he recently wrote, I feel like I have wasted my life. I thought that was fitting, because most of us who bought his pay-per-view fights in the 80s and 90s probably thought we wasted our time as well, because they lasted, 8 seconds, most of those fights. But he said, all the God-given talent that I had, I feel like I have wasted my entire life. Here's a man full of regret as he is going through life. So what causes regret in our lives? I don't know if you've ever been around people who are at the end of their lives and talked with them and witnessed the things that they have said and the regrets that they have. Regrets are always broken down into two things: things that we have done that we wish we hadn't done, or things that we didn't do that we wish we had done. That is what causes regret in our life. And before I go on, can I just say this? If you're here this morning and you're carrying regrets for the things that you've done in your past, don't let those past regrets keep you from coming to Jesus. That's why Jesus came into this world, to die on the cross, and because of his blood that was shed on the cross, those past sins are now forgiven. Don't allow your past regrets to keep you from coming to Jesus and finding a future full of hope and life. Oftentimes we carry regret for what we've done, but I think more often the regrets that we have when we look back on our life, especially as we age and get a little older, the regrets that we carry then more often are associated with those things that we did not do. When we look back at life, we see things that we wish we had done, but we just didn't do them. I remember several years ago, I was at Thanksgiving with my family, and I've told you before, I'm a third-generation pastor. This is what we do, and my grandfather was a pastor, my dad, and now me. And I was sitting at Thanksgiving with my grandfather. I think it was the last Thanksgiving we spent together. And one of my boys, it was either Mason or Gavin, I can't remember which one, ran through the living room, and I don't think they had any clothes on, and everybody's laughing, it's just the way it goes. And my grandfather looked at me. He was sitting on the couch. And he looked at me and he said, you know what? I missed that when my kids were little. I missed seeing that when my kids were little because I was always so busy doing something else. Now, in his defense, what he was doing was he was doing some pretty important work, we would say. He was building the church. He was leading people to Jesus. He was spending time with them. But in doing this important work of building the church, he missed out, I think, on what was most important, spending time with his family. And at the end of the day, the only time I ever heard him express regret was at the end of his life when he said, I missed that. And it was hard for him. I understand the battle because in his mind he thinks I'm doing important work here. And people are constantly patting him on the back and telling him that he's doing a great job and he's making progress. And oftentimes, isn't it hard to find progress being made at home? I mean, when you're telling your kids that Fruit Loops don't go up your nose, isn't it hard to see progress being made? It just is. And so progress was being made. People are patting him on the back. And at the end of the day, though, when he looked back, he said, I regret spending so much time there and missing out on my family. But you know what? His regret is all too common with regrets that other people have. There's a nurse in Australia by the name of Bonnie Ware who spent time in hospice working with patients at the end of their life. And she began to hear regrets of patients over and over again, so she began to track them. And she recently wrote a book about these regrets that people have and how you can overcome these regrets. But she narrowed it down to 5 regrets that all of her hospice patients had in common. And so what I want to do today, right now, is before we go any further, is I want to share these regrets with you. Because I think sometimes when you look back at the end of your life, you get clarity. Looking back always provides you clarity, but also hearing from other people can bring a sense of clarity into our lives as well. So the top 5 regrets, if you're ready, number 5 was this one. I wish I had let myself be happy. I wish I had let myself be happy. She went on to say that most people don't realize till the end that happiness is a choice. Happiness is a choice. It's not a response to our circumstances, but it's a choice in the midst of our circumstances. Most people got to the end of their lives and said, I wish I had let myself be happy. Number 4 is I wish I had had the courage to express my inner feelings. I wished I had the courage to express my inner feelings. This goes back to worry. This speaks to our worry. We're always worried about letting somebody down, worried about what other people think of us. And most people at the end of life said, I wish I had just had the courage to express my inner feelings. Number 3, see if this one resonates with you. I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends and family better. Most patients felt regret for allowing busyness to pull us apart from friendship. Now, it's not that we don't want to. We mean to, don't we? We mean to stay in touch. We mean to stay connected. We mean to reach out. But oftentimes in our busyness, we just forget. And while the days are long, the years are always short. And one day we look back and we wish we had done. Number 2, this is where it gets really interesting and very profound for me. The number 2 regret was I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Number 2, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Bonnie Ware goes on to say that every male patient she nursed had this regret. Did you catch that? Every male patient she nursed had this regret of working too hard. For what they did was they missed their children growing up. They missed the companionship of their wives. All of the men deeply regretted spending so much time on the treadmill of work. And the number one regret is I wish I had the courage to follow my dreams. I wish I had had the courage to follow my dreams. You know, with life almost over, many see so many unfulfilled dreams. What did I say earlier? Most of our regrets center around those things that we did not do. Most patients at the end of their life look back and see the things that they didn't do, and they are filled with regret as a result of that. Now, why don't we accomplish these things? Why don't we do these things? Well, I think for most of us, we feel like we have all the time in the world, don't we? We feel like we're bulletproof and we have all the time in the world. But here's what you need to know. The last time I read the statistics on death from the CDC, they were pretty overwhelming. The statistics on death are pretty overwhelming. It's still 1 out of 1. It's still 100%. All of us in this room are going to face death. We all have limits. We all have an expiration date, however you want to say it. But yet we have this belief, don't we? That we got all the time in the world to do all these things that we want to do. And yet we miss out on so much, and I'm afraid that if we're not careful, we're going to come to the end of our lives, and we're going to have these same regrets. So what do we do about this? How do we get through life without having these regrets? Well, that's what I want to talk about right now with you. So if everybody will just take a deep breath. Didn't that feel good? Let's take a deep breath, and what I want to do is I want to look at some wisdom from a man by the name of Moses. Moses, I think most of you are familiar with that name, but Moses, towards the end of his life in Psalm chapter 90, he gives us some wealth of wisdom, some principles that if we'll follow can help us in this regard of getting to the end of life without regret. Now, the context of Psalm 90, if you got your Bibles, go ahead and open up there. Get there on your apps, your phones, however you read your Bible. Some of these verses are going to be on the screen, not all of them. And so what I want to do is I just want to walk right through Psalm 90 with you today and look at what Moses has written here for us. Now, the context of this, because Bible study is always about context before content. Context before content. The context of this is that Moses is at the end of his life, and he's looking back reflectively over his life experience. Moses lived for 120 years. 120 years. Some of you are like, no thanks, not 120 years, right? 120 years was the lifespan of Moses. Now, his life is really broken up into three different phases, if you will. The first 40 years of his life, he grew up in the palace of Pharaoh. He grew up as a prince of Egypt, having everything that he could ever want, ever desire. But at the end of that 40 years, he realized who his people were. He had been adopted as a child of Pharaoh, but he was really a child of God, of the Israelites. He realized that, and at the end of that 40 years, he tried to free God's people on his own power and strength. He ended up getting in a fight where he killed an Egyptian guard, and as a result of that, he fled for his life. In the next 40 years, he spent as a shepherd in Midian. A shepherd, doing the very thing that he was taught to hate and despise as an Egyptian. He spent 40 years as a shepherd, where every day he got up in the excitement of this, just imagine the excitement of this, of being a shepherd there. He would get up every day and he would take his flock of sheep out and he would sit there and he would watch them graze. And at the end of the day, you know what he did? He gathered them up and he took them back home. And you know what he did the next morning? The same thing. For 40 years, this is what he does. So he goes from the excitement of the palace of Pharaoh to the next 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness. And then the last 40 years of his life, he spends leading God's children out of Egypt. You know, he finds himself in the middle of one of the greatest battles in history where he stands before Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." How many of you are going to be disappointed if you get to heaven and Moses doesn't look like Charlton Heston? Some of you are, I know, it's okay. I might be a little bit. But the last 40 years of his life, he spends leading the nation of Israel from slavery and bondage in Egypt into the promised land. Now, he is kept from entering the promised land. I mean, can you imagine the disappointment? 40 years leading these people, walking around basically in a circle in the wilderness because of their lack of faith and a lack of trust in God. And then Moses himself was not allowed to go into the promised land, but God allows him to go up on a mountain and see it from a distance, which tells us something about the eyesight of Moses, that he could still see it 120 years from a distance. He could see the promised land, but he's not allowed to enter it. And so towards the end of his life, he writes Psalm 90. Now, I think if we'll listen to his words here in Psalm 90, we're going to find some principles that will help us in this battle, because there's something we need to realize. We can gain a wealth of wisdom when we look back. We gain so much perspective on our life, don't we, when we look back? But we can also gain wisdom when we spend time with people who are just a little bit older than us, learning from their wisdom, learning from their perspective as well. And so what we want to do is we want to learn from Moses today. And so this is what Moses writes in Psalm 90, starting in verse 1. If you're there, follow along with me. He says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or before you were brought forth, or before you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Now look back at those words there. Moses says here, God, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. You have been our dwelling place. You have been our protection. You have been our provider for all generations. Notice at the end of his life, Moses looks back at every experience that he has been through, and he notices that God has directed every step of the way. He noticed that God has provided for his children every step of the way. He recognizes that God has been the source of every blessing that has ever come into his life. God, you have been our dwelling place. This is a reminder to Moses that God has provided in the past for his children, and he will continue to provide in the future. Man, if we could just grab on to that right there and recognize, looking back, at how God has taken care of us every step of the way, how God has always provided for us. If we could carry that with us into the future, do you think maybe that would eliminate just a little bit of the worry that we carry with us each and every day? And would help us to get to the end of our lives, and we would not have to look back, and we would not have to say, man, what would life have been like if I had just worried less and trusted God more? God, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. And then he goes on to say, before the mountains were born, before you brought the world into being, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Well, it shows us the perspective that God has on his creation. God was here before creation. God's going to be here at the end as well. God is seeing all of creation. You talk about some perspective here. Now what Moses is going to do is he's going to show us how our life looks to God. Now this might get a little depressing. I just want to throw that out there for you. This might get a little depressing, but hang on in there. Hopefully it'll be better towards the end. But in verse 3, this is what he says. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men. I can't say that without like a pirate guttural accent. That just, return to dust, you know, right? That's just the way I find myself saying that. Sorry about that. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They're like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. I told you this is going to get a little depressing, but hang in there with me. What Moses is doing is he's saying here, imagine how our lives look to God. How does our life look to God? And by the way, also, the return to dust, you mortals, what we're doing there is Moses is recognizing this belief that all of us have that God is somehow in control of the days of our lives. That's a soap opera, isn't it? God is in control of the number, let me say it that way, the number of days that we get. And all of us carry this belief, whether or not you even believe in God, you carry this belief that there is a supreme being out there that is in control of how many days you get. And the reason I know that is because when we find ourselves suddenly sick or a loved one sick, our first reaction is to pray. We pray to God, don't we? Because we believe that he is in control of our lives. And then he goes on to say, God, our lives are like a mere blip on the radar to you. I mean, 1,000 years is like a day to God. Our lives are like a watch in the night, about 3 hours in God's perspective. Our lives are like grass which springs up fresh and new in the morning, and then by evening it is dry and withered. Our lives are so quick in the presence and in the perspective of God. What we think is this long life is really just a blip on the radar to God. Hop down to verse 10 with me here. Verse 10, Moses, once again, as he's showing our perspective, God's perspective, how our life looks in the perspective of God. Verse 10, the length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they what? They quickly pass, and then we fly away. Our days, 70, 80 years if we have the strength, and yet they're full of sorrow and trouble and grief, the best of them are. We've experienced our fair share of sorrow and grief and trouble, haven't we? And yet our days quickly pass, and then we fly away. Everybody excited? Everybody enjoying this so far? It's pretty good stuff. And glad you came to church today, right? Yeah. All right, verse 11. Let's just keep going. Verse 11. Who knows the power of your anger? For your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. This is a hard verse to translate from Hebrew into English, and a lot of people have given a lot of efforts at it, and this is a pretty good translation. But can you let me just kind of paraphrase it for you so we'll see what Moses is saying here about God? What he's saying is, God, if we could see you as you are, we would really give you the reverence that you are due. If we could see your power, your might, your holiness, we would give you the reverence you are due. Or in other words, we would be very more careful with the gifts that you have given us. If we could see how you really are, we would be more careful with the things that you have given us, namely our days and our time. God, if we could see you as you really are, we would be more careful with what you have given us. And then we get down to verse 12. Now in verse 12, here's a principle from Moses that, man, if we'll apply this principle to our lives, it can really change the way we view life. It can also help us get through life without so many regrets. Verse 12. So teach us to number our what? Teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of what? Wisdom. So Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Now, this principle comes in the perspective here of Moses looking back at the end of his life, seeing his life in the perspective of God. And he says, God, if you could just teach us to number our days. You know, this does not come naturally to us. Numbering our days does not come naturally to us because we think we're bulletproof, we're living in the moment. We don't even realize at times that our life one day will end. And so Moses says, teach us that. Teach us to number our days. And if we number our days, there's a promise. What's the promise? Number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we can gain a heart of wisdom. Wisdom in the Old Testament kind of has a double meaning, by the way. One is skill. Wisdom kind of has this meaning and denoting of skill. The second way is it also gives us key insight into life. And so this heart of wisdom that we're promised, if we'll number our days, gives us skill in how to use our days, but also gives us insight as to what's truly important and what truly matters. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You know, numbering our days reminds us that this life is brief. This life is brief. It just is. We got to learn to number our days. So here's what I want to do, because this is really going to excite you here. You ready? The average life expectancy is 80 years. That gives us 29,200 days. That's the number of our days. Ready for some math? If you're in this room and you're around 30, that means that you have about 18,250 days left. If you're 40, which I've turned 40 in the last couple of years, a couple times, you're past the halfway point. You got about 14,600 days left. If you're 50-ish, you have about 10,950 days left. You want me to stop? You just want me to stop? 60, you got about 7,300 days left. There are some of not us, but some of you here who are on borrowed time at this point, right? And we need to realize this. We need to recognize this. There's a principle in this world about value of things, and the more limited something is, the higher value it has. Okay, something's going to have, we're coming up to Christmas, right? And so someone's going to introduce this new toy that's going to be the hottest toy, and then they're going to make just a limited number of them, and that's going to cause the value to do what? Skyrocket. And then there's going to be Cabbage Patch Kid revolts in the mall where everybody's trying to find this toy, and there are going to be fights everywhere because the value is so high. When something is limited, the value increases. Our days are limited. So therefore, the value increases of our days. I can say it this way. Since our days are limited, we need to limit how we spend our days. Since our days are limited, we need to limit how we spend our days. And this causes us to focus on things that I think are truly important. There are things that we know we should do that we just don't get around to doing. Why? Because we'll do it later, or someday we'll do that. Counting our days, I think, helps us to make our someday into today. It turns our someday into today, and those things that we know that we should be doing that we don't do, we tend to find ourselves doing. But the question is, what's truly important? What truly matters? What should we be focusing on? Because I think this is a struggle for some of us to know what is truly important, what truly matters, and what we should be focusing on, because we look at life as a race. We think life is a race against each other, to do as much, to get as much, to be as much as we possibly can. Life's a race. Listen, life is not a race, but rather God has created you and I uniquely to be able to do certain things. And so what is unique to you? What is unique to me? Those are the things we should be focusing on. There's two roles in my life that are unique. Two things that are unique. Everything else I do, somebody else can and will do and probably do them better than me. Two things that are unique to me. One is I am husband to Eve. Two is I'm the parent to my children. Those are the only two things that are unique to me. And those two unique roles mean that what should be most important to me is, number one, should be discipling my family to grow in their faith and relationship with Jesus Christ. That is what is most important to me. Now, why in the world would I trade something that is unique for me for something that somebody else can and will do? That's a bad trade. That's a bad trade. No, I need to focus. My priority needs to be my wife and my children. And recently I heard somebody say something that has just stuck with me. Our children don't need more to do. They need more time with you. Boy, boy, that just struck me. My children don't need more to do. They need more time with me. So that means if I'm too busy to spend time with my kids and to teach them about Jesus, then I'm just too busy. If I'm too busy to eat dinner with my family regularly during the week, I'm too busy. If I'm too busy to sit and talk with my wife, I'm too busy. I'm just too busy. Why would I trade what's unique for me for something that somebody else can and will do? I want to give you an exercise this week. I want you to think, and I know this is not fun and exciting to think, but I want you to think at the end of your life. What do you hope to hear people say about you at the end of your life, especially those who knew you best and were closest to you? What do you hope to hear them say? Do you want them to say, he worked so hard or she worked so hard? Do you want them to say she was just so busy and involved in everything? Do you want to hear your children say, he was a great father? He always had time for me and he pointed me to Jesus. What do you want to have said about you at the end of your life? And whatever that is, that becomes your life goal. And so my question is this now. Does your schedule today help you achieve your goals tomorrow? Does your schedule today help you achieve your goals tomorrow? And if not, what do we need to change to make that happen? You know, our days are limited, so we need to limit how we spend our days. Moses says, teach us. Teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Can I pray for you this morning? Father, teach us. Lord, teach us to number our days. Remind us that our time here is so brief. It's so limited. So we need to focus on what truly matters, what's truly important, Lord. And so I just pray that you'll help us to reflect that in our lives and in the way that we live. Lord, I thank you for the wisdom that you give us. In the name of Jesus we pray.